Welcome, everyone. On behalf of the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy, I'd like to thank you for joining today's webinar about the conservative case for climate action with Republican Executive Director Bob Inglis. My name is Chris Carnevale, and I'm the Coastal Climate and Energy Manager for the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy. For those of you not familiar with the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy, we are a nonprofit organization that promotes responsible energy choices that work to address the impacts of global climate change and ensure clean, safe, and healthy communities throughout the Southeast. We're a membership organization, and we'd like to acknowledge our members on the call and encourage those of you who are not members to please join us today. For ways in which you can become a member and get involved, please visit our website, cleanenergy.org. Now I'd like to take a moment to review the basic functions of the Zoom platform on the bottom of your screen. To ensure sound quality, all attendee lines will be muted throughout the presentation. If you're having trouble hearing or seeing the slides, actually we won't be using slides today, so if you're having trouble hearing, click the chat button and type in your problem so that we can help you troubleshoot. We've saved time at the end of the presentation to answer questions. So to ask a question, click the Q&A button along the bottom of your screen, and we'll work to get to as many questions as we can at the end. And go ahead and feel free to submit questions throughout the presentation, even though we won't be answering them until the end. Finally, we're recording the webinar, and we'll send you the link to the recording by email. Next slide, please. This webinar is part of the Southeast Coastal Climate Network webinar series. The Southeast Coastal Climate Network is a network of individuals and organizations interested in climate and energy in the Southeast. If you enjoyed today's webinar and would like to receive regular news updates and action alerts, please join the network by visiting cleanenergy.org/SECCN or email me at chris@cleanenergy.org. Next slide, please. Joining us to present today is Bob Inglis. Bob launched the Energy and Enterprise Initiative at George Mason University in July 2012 and serves as Executive Director, where he promotes free enterprise action on climate change. For his work on climate change, Inglis was given the 2015 John F. Kennedy Profile and Courage Award. He appears in the film Merchants of Doubt and in the Showtime series Years of Living Dangerously, and he spoke at TEDx Jacksonville. Inglis was a resident fellow at Harvard University's Institute of Politics in 2011, a visiting energy fellow at Duke University's Nicholas School of the Environment in 2012, and a resident fellow at the University of Chicago's Institute of Politics in 2014. Bob was elected to the U.S. Congress in 1992, having never run for office before. He represented Greenville-Spartanburg, South Carolina, from 1993 to 1998. In 2004, he was re-elected to Congress and served until losing re-election in the South Carolina Republican primary of 2010. Inglis grew up in the low country of South Carolina, went to Duke University for college, met and married his college sweetheart, graduated from the University of Virginia School of Law, and practiced commercial real estate law in Greenville, South Carolina, before and between his years in Congress. Bob and Mary Ann Inglis have 5 adult children and live on a small farm in northern Greenville County, South Carolina. So with that, I'll turn it over to Bob.
Thanks, Chris. Great to be with you. And thanks for the folks that are joining us. I'm very interested in the chats that'll come, the questions that will come, because mostly I want to make sure to scratch people where they're itching. And if you want to know about free enterprise solutions to climate change, let's talk about those and specifically answer your questions. So please do chime in with those questions. Here's what we do at republicen.org. We are conservatives reaching conservatives on climate change. The best idea I came across when I was in Congress, as Chris just said, I was there 6 years, gone 6, came back for another 6. The best idea I came across was a simple way of pricing in the hidden cost of the burning of fossil fuels. And that if that's done, then we would unleash an energy revolution that would light up dark places of the world, probably with distributed energy systems, reducing the cause of war and envy because people would actually have power, and increasing the sense of freedom and autonomy here at home. And if we play our cards right, we will sell those systems. We will invent, perfect, commercialize, and sell those systems all around the world, creating jobs and wealth here at home, and, as I say, improving living conditions all around the world. So most often, climate change is presented in the milieu of death and destruction, and oh, it's so bad. It is all of those things, but it's also an incredible opportunity to light up the world with more energy, more mobility, and more freedom. And we can do that if we just internalize negative externalities. Now, that's a rather complicated way of saying it, maybe internalize negative externalities. And I once had a friend who is in the communications business tell me, I hope you've got a better message than that. And I said, well, it's sort of like the time I said to the Greenville News, the largest newspaper in the district that I represented, the 4th District of South Carolina. I said one time to a reporter, we need to internalize negative externalities. And he stopped me. He said, what'd you say? And I said, internalize negative externalities. He said, I can't write that in this paper, man. We write at the 7th grade level. And so I said, reveal the hidden cost. Next day it said in the paper, Inglis says we got to reveal the hidden cost of the burning of fossil fuels. So it's really the same thing. It's in other words, the idea is this. When we burn fossil fuels, we get away with socializing our soot, basically. We put it in the air, the garbage dump in the sky. We're not accountable for it. And it creates damages, health damages that are real and immediate and quantifiable. You can talk to pulmonologists about their patients and what they go through when they get these kind of particulates in their lungs. And so if I'm Inglis coal-fired electricity, I get to just pump this stuff into the sky. Now I scrub it a little bit, but I get to still pump a fair amount into the trash dump of the sky. Now, most of my neighbors just cough it up when it comes into their lungs, but some of them end up in the hospital. And when they show up at the hospital, we're all paying. That's the negative externality. It has a cost to it. It's real, it's quantifiable, and it's not accounted to me at Inglis coal-fired electricity. I get away with dumping into that trash dump of the sky for free. It's a great deal for me, and it looks like a good deal for my customers because they get cheaper electricity that way, right? Because if you make me accountable, then what I've got to do is I've got to buy additional scrubbers. I got to put all kinds of new equipment in my plant and take out those small particulates. And if my neighbors ever get tired of breathing my soot and convince Congress to do that to me and tell me to be even biblically accountable by holding my ash on my property and not doing on my property something that harms somebody else's life or property, then I'm going to be heard to complain to the local member of Congress, oh no, Mr. Congressman or Ms. Congresswoman, you can't do that to me. Because if you do, I'm going to have to increase the price of my electricity. And my customers, who are your constituents, are going to be powerfully mad at you because their electricity rates are going to go up. And at republicen.org, we dream of the day that the conservative member of Congress looks back to me, Inglis coal-fired electricity, and says, Inglis, we're already paying the full cost of your supposedly cheap coal-fired electricity. We're paying right now at the hospital because somebody went in there and they're on Medicare, like my 95-year-old dad. We're paying. There's a Medicare tax that we all pay on our earnings. We're paying. Or maybe it's my Down syndrome niece who's got Medicaid coverage. We're paying all right. That's general tax revenue. Or maybe it's somebody that, like you, maybe is covered by Blue Cross and Blue Shield. Blue Cross and Blue Shield has to increase the premiums for all of its insureds because of Inglis coal-fired electricity. And so at some point, conservatives are going to look back at me and say, Inglis, we're already paying the full cost of your supposedly cheap power, just not at the power meter. We're paying at the healthcare system. And a whole nother category of damages we're paying is climate damages. These are longer term and a little bit harder to quantify than the immediate health cost, but they're real and they are going to be paid. And again, on this, we dream of the day at republicen.org when conservatives will say, there is no such thing as a free lunch. That's sort of a basic tenet of conservatism. And so applied here, it'd be, Inglis, we are selling us supposedly cheap electricity, but it's causing these long-term damages. In Charleston, for example, we're going to have to elevate the roads. In Miami, they're already doing that. They're pumping water out in places that used to just flow out in Miami. Now you got to put power behind it to jet it out into the bay. Why? Well, because of people like me at Inglis coal-fired electricity creating climate damages. And so, so the idea that we have is simply to bring accountability. It's a very simple, rock-solid conservative message, which is that accountability brings blessings. Lack of accountability results in havoc. And climate change is that havoc. So this is something that really is bedrock conservatism, but for right now, it seems foreign to conservatives. It seems like what they've heard is something like this. The godless scientists got together with the UN bureaucrats. They looped in the Wall Street traders, and they came up with a monstrosity called cap and trade. Well, because I thought it was hopelessly complicated, embarrassing in the free allocations for the well-connected that would have decimated American manufacturing, and because it was a massive tax increase, I voted against it when I was in Congress. And I proposed the alternative that I'll describe in a minute. But just think of conservatives hearing that message about the UN and the godless scientists and the Wall Street traders and cap and trade. And then when that didn't work or that failed, the secret Muslim non-American socialist came up, he's none of those things, by the way, but came up with this idea of a regulatory answer in the Clean Power Plan. Well, there's nothing in these two proposals that's attractive to conservatives. One is an international agreement with the UN that seems complicated, and it was in fact very complicated. The other is a regulatory answer, grows the size of the regulatory state. That's just not anything that conservatives could warm to. So we come along with the alternative, which is basically tax carbon dioxide, and that's a terrible thing to say, isn't it? Tax, who wants a new tax? But this tax would be a rather unique tax. It'd be applied at the mine and at the pipeline, so there'd be a very small job for the IRS because there are under 2,000 companies that either mine coal or put stuff in a pipeline for us. So it's a very small job for the IRS, administratively simple. So you put a tax on at the mine and at the pipeline. And then this is what's so odd about this tax. You pair it with a reduction in other taxes or a dividend of all of the money back to the taxpayers so that there's no growth of government. It's simply untaxing some form of income or dividending the money back so that it's all coming back to taxpayers. It's not growing the government. And so it's essentially untaxing some form of income and putting a tax on carbon dioxide. What that accomplishes is the internalization of the negative externalities. That means that then Inglis coal-fired electricity is now having to show at the meter the true cost of my electricity, because now I'm no longer getting away with dumping into the trash dump of the sky for free. I've got to pay a tipping fee. A little bit like the tipping fee that a trash hauler has to pay when they go to the city dump. The reason we put on those fees, or taxes, if you will, at the city dump, is that otherwise the dump fills up really quickly. And then society has to go build another dump. And so anybody that dumps a lot without a tax, without a fee, gets away with socializing their trash and getting society to pay for their trash hauling business. So what we say to trash haulers is, no, you got to pay for the space you take up in our city dump. And they, of course, pass this cost on to their customers. But that's appropriate, isn't it? Again, back to this idea of accountability and paying for what we take. And so you take up space in the city dump, you pay for it. And then society doesn't have to build a new dump and subsidize your business. It's rather that everybody's paying as we go. The same concept of this carbon tax is that we pay for the space we're taking up, the allowance we've got in the atmosphere for carbon dioxide. And so if you want to use some of that allowance, we'll pay for it. Just like, as we like to say, in the salad bar of life, take what you want, but pay for what you take. Because otherwise, the restaurant owner can't offer much on that salad bar. If you don't pay for what you take, then that restaurant owner can only have a little bit of iceberg lettuce and maybe some Thousand Island dressing and maybe some really cheap croutons. And that's the salad that she or he could offer you. But if you're willing to pay the actual cost of the salad ingredients, then the restaurant owner can have maybe some sliced turkey and some nice mushrooms and some field greens and various kinds of interesting stuff on the salad bar, because you're paying for what you take. And if you don't want the turkey, don't take it. But may I suggest mushrooms are a lot lighter and therefore a lot cheaper on the salad bar. But if you want the sliced turkey, go ahead and take it. Just pay for it. So in the same way, pay for what you take if you're taking up space in the atmosphere in our allowance for CO2 up there. So the unique thing about this tax is it's immediately returned back to the people. The other unique thing about this tax is it's applied to imports in the same way as if they'd been made here. So we say to China, for example, we're going to collect a tax on your goods on entry into the United States based on the carbon content of those goods. So China probably would challenge that in the World Trade Organization, saying it's an impermissible tariff. But we think at republicen.org that they lose that case based on precedents in the chemical industry, which basically say that you can tax on entry based on the content of the goo coming in. And so this would be a content tax. So right now, in the port of Charleston, there's a sheet of flat steel coming through, maybe from a Chinese company. We would apply a tax there. And China, as I say, would challenge in the World Trade Organization. If they lose, as we expect them to lose that case, 24 hours later, because they have an amazing way of reaching consensus in China, they would impose the same price on carbon dioxide internal to China. Why? Because otherwise they're paying a tax on entry through the port of Charleston, and the money's going to Washington that they could have applied in China, and the money would have gone to Beijing. Well, governments everywhere want more money, so they would impose their own carbon tax. And then the flat steel would come through the port of Charleston without any adjustment. Fine, we're open to trade. We believe in trade. We believe in markets. We believe in free enterprise. But where carbon pollution anywhere is climate change everywhere. And so we would apply that to those Chinese goods. So the result is that we end up then with the whole world following American leadership. And here's the beautiful thing for conservatives. I'm not talking here about any broad international agreement. All I'm talking about is a bold move by the United States, where the United States says, we're going to lead on this thing, this problem of climate change. We're going to adopt a free enterprise solution that just brings accountability for emissions. We're not growing our government, but we are going to require anybody doing business with us to pay the same tax. The whole world then follows. No international agreement, just bold leadership by the United States. And then we've got the whole world seeing the true cost of fossil fuel burning. And then we get the energy revolution that I was talking about at the outset here, and here soon I'm going to stop talking and turn to your questions and comments. But that's where it gets exciting, because then what you have is not 300 plus million Americans seeing the true cost of energy at their power meter and calling the solar installer to come to my house quickly and get on a solar cell on the roof, or get a solar hot water heater up there, or figure out a way to insulate my house better, or do various things, because then it's in my economic interest, not because I'm being a good boy or being prodded to do so by some fickle tax incentive, or being commanded to do so by some regulation, by some government bureaucrat rolling by in a government sedan telling me what I got to do at my house. No, none of that. Just me, in the liberty of enlightened self-interest, choosing to economize, and by choosing solar for my roof, and by putting this whole hot water heater up there, and by insulating better and doing all those things. So we'd have 300 plus million Americans doing that, but then through this border adjustment, that's applying the tax to other countries, we'd have the whole world on that. So then you have 7 billion people around the world seeing the true cost of energy and demanding new products, new innovations. And that's when it gets exciting in free enterprise, because now you've got a market for clean energy that isn't supported by mandates or regulations or fickle tax incentives, but rather is supported by the self-interest, the enlightened self-interest of people all around the world. That's a good customer. That's an opportunity for economic growth. That's an opportunity for creating jobs and wealth here in America if we play it right. Like I say, we've got to be the ones that invent those systems, that invent the better batteries, that perfect the better solar cells, that make better nuclear. We do those things, and we're going to have an exciting opportunity on our hands. So, like I said, it's the best idea I came across in Congress, this idea of internalizing negative externalities or revealing the hidden cost. It's a price signal, not a regulatory approach. It fits with conservative concepts, and it's really a pretty exciting thing, and avoids the downside, the troubles that we can go into if you ask questions about climate change itself. It's a dark story. There are a lot of bad things that could happen to us. The alternative is some pretty exciting stuff if we just get on with innovation. So let me help, or have Chris help me with questions. There are things that I should be able to answer here.
Great. Thank you for those words, Bob. And yes, we do have a number of questions that have come in already. And just as a reminder, please keep submitting questions. We have plenty of time to get through them. Submit them with the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen, and we'll try to get through as many as possible. So first question, there's some questions about kind of the carbon tax and the strategy for how to allocate the carbon tax. You mentioned either dividends or some sort of tax reduction. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that, and maybe talk about what your plan proposed when you were in Congress, and just generally kind of what's the strategy of allocating the refund among the tax base.
Yeah, great question. So yeah, at republicen.org, we're rather ecumenical about what to do with the revenue that comes from the carbon tax. We'd be happy with a corporate tax reduction, an individual tax reduction, a payroll tax reduction, or a dividend. Any of those are fine with us. And answer your question, Chris, I had a bill in Congress. It was the alternative, as I said earlier, to cap and trade, which was this revenue neutral, border adjustable carbon tax. And it would have cut payroll taxes. Payroll taxes are the 6.2% that shows up on your check if you're an employee, and then there's a 6.2% that you don't see that your employer pays. So it's a 12.4% tax on the first dollar of income. It's probably the most regressive tax that we've got. It hits poor people harder than wealthy people. And so if you reduce and put on a carbon tax, the Congressional Budget Office says that the bottom 70 percentile in America do better under that carbon tax scenario than they're doing under the current payroll tax scenario. So that was the bill that I had. But we're open to, we're happy if people would rather do a dividend, for example. That's where you take the carbon tax money and you return it probably per capita to the people. You just send checks like the Alaska Permanent Fund check. It has some advantage of overcoming some of the regressivity of the carbon tax. It also has a political advantage, which is that people like getting that check from the Alaska Permanent Fund. And so there'd be support for a steadily rising carbon tax, which it needs to be a steadily rising carbon tax, because we're going to experience what economists call the substitution effect. And that is, once people see the true cost of my electricity at Inglis coal-fired electricity, they're going to innovate away from that price signal. They're going to do things so that they use less of my now true cost energy. And that's going to cause a declining revenue stream from the carbon tax to the government. So in order to keep the incentive going, and particularly if you're doing a payroll tax reduction, that's how we fund Social Security. You can't make Social Security any worse than it already is. So you got to have a steadily rising carbon tax. But so the advantage of the dividend is there'd be a political constituency for that steadily rising carbon tax, because we'd all enjoy getting a slightly larger check each quarter or each year under the carbon tax, just like the residents of Alaska get.
Great, thank you for explaining some of that. We have several other questions that kind of dovetail with that. I think you kind of just started to get into this, but someone asks, what about the feedback loops? Do polluters continue to trash but just pass along the cost to consumers? When does the polluter feel it's enough to slow or stop practices that are causing carbon pollution?
Well, it is true that the polluters do pass along the cost, just like the trash hauler passes on the cost to us if we're pay for a private service like I do in the country here in upstate South Carolina to come pick up my trash. They pass that cost of the tipping fee on to me. Now, if I'm Inglis coal-fired electricity and I have to retrofit my plant with more scrubbers and do things like that, and the cost of my electricity goes up, yes, I pass it on immediately to my customers. But that becomes the opportunity for solar and wind and nuclear to compete with me. And so Yeah, that is the exactly what we want to happen. Actually, we want the price to be passed on to the consumer, so that the consumer sees the actual cost. Right now, what we deal with is something like it's like playing hide and seek with a 3-year-old. A 3-year-old will put their hands over their face and say, "I hiding, you can't see me." That's the way we're doing right now with the cost of the burning of fossil fuels. We're pretending that they're not there, but they're there. And so you want it to be that the consumer can actually see it on the bill. And so when they see it, that's when they, on their own, without any government directive or mandate or incentive even, they're calling the solar hot water heater installer. They're calling the solar electricity person. They're innovating, and that creates that marketplace that then drives the innovation. So, like cell phones, they were once expensive, and now they're really a lot more affordable. And the result is a lot of us have them and use them. And so, same thing's going to happen in energy, and that's what's so exciting. And I realize now that some people perhaps don't share my confidence in free enterprise there and my confidence in the liberty of enlightened self-interest. But let me just give you an example from cell phones. In the 1980s, AT&T was thinking about going whole hog into cell phones. They asked the consulting group McKinsey to estimate for them the number of cell phones that would be in service at year Y2K, as the year 2000 rolled around. So McKinsey thought and came back with the answer, 800,000. Well, the problem for McKinsey was there were 800,000 cell phones going into service every 3 days when Y2K rolled around. So they had missed it by a lot. And so, but in fairness to McKinsey, back then in the mid 80s, cell phones were bulky. They were in bags and they had wires on them, and you talked like you're talking on your home phone, except in your car. It's about $1 a minute. Service wasn't any good. The battery didn't last. So it's understandable why they thought not many people use these things. Similarly, today we could say, well, how many people got solar? How many people have electric cars? Well, only a small percentage right now. But I wouldn't, if you're working at McKinsey, be careful what you say about what's going to happen once those costs are internalized, because it may be like that 800,000 every 3 days going into service. That's what's coming out there is my faith in free enterprise, and you can see how that fits with conservatives and how that makes it a comfortable thing for them.
Great, thanks. Just a reminder to folks, keep the questions coming. You can type them in the Q&A box. Patrick asks how, whether carbon dividend or tax reduction, how would this not grow the IRS or local tax officials?
Well, it would be a new addition to the work of the IRS, but consider how small it would be. If you have only 2,000 taxpayers that are either mining coal or putting stuff in a pipeline, it's a job that the IRS could do in a very small room. 2,000 taxpayers is nothing for the IRS. And so it's a very small job. It's one of the beauties of this is the beauty of an upstream application of the tax. It doesn't have to be that way, by the way. You could do a downstream application of the tax at the point of sale, let's say. And British Columbia in Canada does this where you can see it at the gas pump. That's a downstream application of the tax. But for administrative simplicity, it seems to us at republicen.org, and I think to many others, that it's just a lot easier to go upstream, right to the mine, right to the pipeline. And but as there's an answer in the last question, yeah, the price of everything from that pipeline goes up. The price of everything coming out of that coal mine goes up. And that is, of course, this is the hard thing about what we're talking about, because some people could just focus in on that and say, are you nuts, man? Why in the world would you want to increase the price of electricity? Why would you want to increase the price of gasoline and natural gas and even propane for my grill? That's nuts. But then what you say is, yeah, but the money's going to come back to you in the form of a dividend check or cutting taxes elsewhere. And then, yeah, if you want to grill all day on a huge grill, if you want to, just pay for the CO2 space that you're taking up in the atmosphere. Some people would want to regulate that. They'd want to say, okay, no more propane grills. You can only, I don't know how you'd grill out without propane. But anyway, you got to do it some other way. That's a regulatory approach. But we say better to just make people accountable. If you got a great big house, I'm glad for you. Invite me to your house. Let me swim in your heated pool. So use as much energy as you want to use. Just pay for the whole cost of it. And don't get away with a lack of accountability. So others would take a regulatory approach. No, you can't have a heated pool. No, your house can't be more than, 3,000 square feet. That's a respectable approach, I suppose, particularly for some on the left. But for those of us on the right, we say, no, build as big a house as you want to. Just pay for all of it and don't get away with a lack of accountability.
Awesome. Thanks for that answer, and thank you everyone for submitting these really good questions. We have several more questions about kind of the revenue neutral portion of this. So right now there are there's a lot of subsidies that exist in the energy marketplace to both renewable and conventional electricity generation sources. What happens to those? And Patrick asks, will the tax breaks continue to go to energy corporations for various things like exploration, equipment, distribution, et cetera?
Oh, great question. Yeah, well, this is where we're really quite conservative at republicen.org. We think we should eliminate all of the subsidies, and that means really all of the subsidies. So no more of the ones that are so criticized by the right in America. Things like electric car credits, we'd eliminate those. Production tax credit for wind, we'd eliminate that. Investment tax credit for solar, we'd eliminate that. Then those get hearty amens from the Tea Party and Trump supporters, because they say, yeah, why should those people get those good things? But then we get on a little bit more difficult ground when we start saying, yeah, and eliminate all of the special tax benefits that oil and gas have. Eliminate under-market leases on public land for the extraction of minerals. Make those fair market value leases. And eliminate the biggest subsidy of them all, which we were talking about earlier, which is this ability to dump into the trash dump at the sky without paying a tipping fee. So across the board, we'd eliminate all those subsidies. All of those are subsidies. And the ones that are apparent and are very criticized by my friends on the right are those first ones I mentioned: electric car credits, production tax credit for wind, investment tax credit for solar. But the ones that are missed by the right that we're calling attention to are all those benefits for oil and gas, and all those the implicit benefit, the implicit subsidy of being able to dump the soot into the air and to dump CO2 into the air without paying for the space you're taking up. And so again, it's a message of accountability that brings in the blessing of people acting responsibly, not because they were closely regulated, but rather just because they saw the price of it, the true price of it.
Yeah, and that's a good segue to the next question. Luke asks, how do you calculate the appropriate price of carbon?
Great question, and it's very hard. And so it's like this. I once was making the mistake of saying, I'll go as high as you want on a price on carbon dioxide, a carbon tax, as long as you give me a corresponding tax cut somewhere else. And then Michael Boskin, who is one of Ronald Reagan's economics advisors, corrected me. He told me, Bob, that's not correct. You need to be saying that you want to set the carbon price at the harm of the next ton of CO2 emitted. Don't go back and consider legacy, because that creates economic inefficiencies. It's just the harm of the next ton of CO2. And so arriving at that, so that's where you want to set this carbon price. That's how we're going to set the carbon tax. Again, that just brings accountability. It's not a made up price. It's sort of it's an attempt to approximate the actual damages that would be caused by that next ton of CO2. Now, here's the challenge. Approximating those damages is pretty difficult, and it requires an awful lot of analysis. The economists can help us some, but they can't get us all the way to the answer, because under standard discounting, you could make the value of your great-great-great-granddaughter's life about $4.64, and that's what she goes on the scales as. At that point, we turn away from the economist and toward the ethicists, the pastors, the rabbis, the priests, who might tell us, no, that great-great-granddaughter has to be worth more than $4.64. In other words, there are ethical considerations. So what you end up with is a big discussion about and debate with a lot of give and take and a lot of probably contention about what to set the price at. And the thing that we got to just admit at the start is it's not some kind of holy writ that's going to come down from heaven that tells us what that price is, what the actual harm of the next ton of CO2 is. It's going to be arrived at by a push and pull of the political process. And so it's just that right now we've pretty much said that the harm being caused by the next ton of CO2 is about zero. There's no harm. That's what we're saying right now. By our policies, and that's clearly not correct. And so the price, it's a lot of people talking about is somewhere $25 a ton. Maybe it's $40 a ton. That's where I'd guess it'd be, somewhere in that range. And of course, then this is an important thing for people to quantify or help pass on to friends as they consider the carbon tax, is to some extent we're afraid of it because we think, oh my goodness, based on what we've heard from some people, the carbon tax would destroy the American economy, destroy the whole world economy, for goodness sakes. It's going to bring doom, according to some folks. So let's quantify it. A $25 per ton price on carbon dioxide results in a 25-cent per gallon increase in the price of gasoline. Can we take that? I think we can, because we're all sort of used to the fluctuation about 25 cents a gallon. It's not a great big deal. It's not going to end the American economy. And it causes electricity rates to go up by 1 to 2 cents per kilowatt hour, depending on where you live. If you're in Washington State, you barely notice the carbon tax because they're so heavily hydro. And hydro doesn't have any emissions, so there wouldn't be really much of a carbon tax applied in Washington State. If you're in Mike Pence's Indiana, you're going to feel it because they're somewhere in the high 80% range of coal-fired electricity. They're really belching a lot into that trash dump of the sky without any accountability in Indiana. And so if they're brought to accountability, they're going to feel it. They're going to be at the high end of that 2 cents per kilowatt hour range. In my home state of South Carolina, we're going to be in pretty good shape because we're 50% nuclear, thank goodness. And so that means that we won't feel it as much as, say, Mike Pence's Indiana will feel it. But in other words, we got to quantify. It's not the end of the world. It is a price signal. It does impact things at the margins. It does move products off of the shelf in the laboratory into production, because then the economics would work for those new ways of making electricity. It does drive innovation for better batteries and better solar cell efficiency, but it's not catastrophic to the economy. In fact, if you go on our website at republicen.org, you'll see Art Laffer, another one of Ronald Reagan's economics advisors, saying that you could probably improve the economy if you do this carbon tax the right way.
Great. So we have a number of questions. We have some, I've kind of lumped them into trade policy questions and then kind of political questions and how this gets implemented. So let's do a couple trade policy questions now. You mentioned placing a price on, for example, sheets of steel coming into the Port of Charleston. So the question is, with all the different imports coming into the U.S., wouldn't it be a large job to individually price each of those items coming in?
Yeah, it would be. It'd be a huge job. And here's the thing that's so strange about that job. It'd go away within a couple of 3 weeks or a month or two. It'd be really a rather strange setup, because you'd have to set up this whole system of figuring out what the tax to be applied on entry. But then, if we're right and the World Trade Organization upholds the tax and says it is permissible as a content tax, then that whole new agency set up to apply the tax at the border would staff up and then staff down. And we'd all forget whatever was written in those books, because the whole world would follow us. And then you wouldn't need it anymore. So it'd be the shortest lived agency in history, I would predict. Now, there's a way to avoid the trouble of going through that setup and then takedown, and that is to try to use diplomacy, something that perhaps we want to really rediscover, which is to go to our trading partners and say, we know you want to act on this too. Can we, we're going to do this. We in America are going to do this. And we know that everybody wants access to our market. That's why we've got strength to do this. But can we talk to you in advance about how we're going to do it, and maybe get some signals from China that maybe they won't fight so hard in the World Trade Organization. Maybe they could live with it. Maybe because they're feeling climate change in their throats and in their eyes, a little bit like the way we saw water pollution with the Cuyahoga River on fire in the 1960s. Maybe they're feeling climate change. And even if they are repressive Chinese dictators, and I believe they are repressive Chinese dictators, they have a kid and a spouse who's chewing on their ears saying, why can't our kid go out and play soccer? And so how about get with it, honey, and do something about this? And so there's a way to perhaps head off the setting up of this agency we're talking about by getting some advance agreements. But again, it doesn't require that, because the United States can act unilaterally here. And that's something that's important to conservatives, because conservatives rightly distrust turning over American sovereignty to the UN and to international agreements. And so George Washington told us that in the farewell address. So it's sort of the DNA of America to avoid entangling alliances. But there's a way to perhaps get advance agreement, though, and it might go rather smoothly. I will tell you, too, one time I was at the Milken Institute, and I was on a panel, and I described the carbon tax that I've described here. And then the moderator, Andy Revkin, turned to a Chinese professor who I hope is a highly placed spy, because the professor tapped Diane Regas of Environmental Defense Fund on the knee, who she was sitting next to him, and said, "I know we're working with you on a cap and trade system in our country, in China, but I really prefer what Bob Inglis has just described. That carbon tax is really the better, simpler way to do this." So like I say, I hope that Chinese professor is actually a highly placed spy, and that he has the ear of Mr. Xi, and that really that's what they'd prefer to do. Because if they would, we can move along quickly to this. By the way, it's also important, Australia had a tax, undid it, did it again, undid it. And some people would point out, well, that's a problem. See, Australia's already had a problem with this. Well, they did have a problem. The reason is Australia is a teeny economy compared to the United States. They just don't have many people there compared to us. And so we're the market that everybody wants access to. And so fine then, we'll take your goods. It's just you're going to pay our carbon tax on entry. Oh, if you want to have your own carbon tax, that's fine. Then your goods come in without any entry tax.
Okay. Thanks for explaining that a little more. Another trade policy question from Ted. Do we already suffer as a country or a market European Union firms already pricing carbon into deals? He says, for example, Mars Candy and DSM were talking about proactively pricing carbon even into their U.S. deals. Are you familiar with anything like that?
Well, you know, I don't know about Mars and what they're talking about, but it is interesting to think about how goods from Europe might have that impact, would have the impact, I suppose, of that price already worked in there, unless there's some way to remove it in a border adjustment. But it's also true that, you know, several years ago, there was a case involving the Europeans were going to impose a carbon tax on jet aviation fuel, and impose a tax as on planes arriving. And that case, as far as I know, has been deferred, but at republicen.org, we're really hoping for a decision in the case, because it really would show where the World Trade Organization is going on the permissibility of imposing essentially a border adjustment, a content tax. But anyway, that's a little bit beyond my knowledge as a commercial real estate lawyer rather than a trade lawyer. But the point is that we also may have a real strange turn of events if China imposes a price on carbon dioxide internal to China, either through the cap and trade system they're considering or through a carbon tax that they're also experimenting with. If they start imposing a tax on entry of our goods, that'd be an interesting turn of events. Now, truth be known, there's a lot more coming this way than going that way. But Boeing from Charleston sells some mighty fine airplanes that end up in China. So we might just get hit with a border adjustment ourselves on entry of our goods into China. That might cause us to wake up and realize, whoa, 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 we want to be the leaders here, not China.
All right. So Greg Hamra, one of our attendees, typed in and said, many utilities are already internally pricing carbon. So are Shell, ExxonMobil, and other oil giants, and over 1,000 other companies, including Google, Microsoft, Disney, etc. You can learn more at hamra.net, HAMRA.net/price it. Thanks, Greg. Okay, we only have a few minutes left, so we've had a number of questions about kind of the politics and how Washington, D.C., how politicians are reacting to the possibility of a carbon tax, if there's been any shift, particularly among Republican and conservative members of Congress. Daphne, for example, says people like Joe Wilson and even President Trump have said that climate change is a hoax. So if you could just end our time by talking a little bit about the prospects of the carbon tax moving forward, what it would take or what citizens can do to effectively advocate for that. And again, Greg brings up the Citizens Climate Lobby and is wondering if you might be able to speak a little bit about that.
Yeah. So here's the thing. Politicians typically follow, they don't lead. It's a very rare bird in politics who actually leads. Because if you lead, you get out front, you get shot from behind. Because in politics, there are a lot of people that want to take your place, and they will come up behind you and stab you in the back while you're leading forward. And so that's just the way it is, right? And so it's really, we can't count on the politicians so much as we've got to count on ourselves. We have to show that we're ready for this adult conversation as full citizens, rather than people who submit to being lied to and deceived. Like back to that analogy of the 3-year-old, you play hide and seek. You can't see me, I hiding. We've got to show the politicians that we're ready for the conversation about balancing the budget, about energy, about making these difficult choices. And acting like full citizens rather than people that can be bought off with the most simplistic stories about how some other is the cause of our trouble and blame it on them. So it all comes back to us, citizens, more than the Congress to decide this. And so what that means is effectively presenting that voice and really being the hand raiser. I can see this happening someday. Say in the Charleston County GOP, let's say Charleston County GOP, and maybe there'll be some politician there in the next couple of months who's railing about how these crazy liberals want to do something about climate change, and then maybe one person in the Q&A time could raise their hand. Some brave Republican could stand up and say, "Sir or ma'am, the streets in Charleston are flooding. Sea level rise is real." And then some other person stands up right away and says, "Yeah, that's right. I'm done with this climate denial stuff." And then 2 or 3 others. And now in that moment, that politician will learn something. But what it takes is that first person brave enough to stand up and say, "I'm done with this. I'm done with climate denial. The water is in the streets of Charleston. Do something." And then 2 or 3 others, and I can tell you from many experiences in Washington, the way this works is all it takes is a couple or 3 people speaking against what is the tribal orthodoxy to turn it around. And so that's what we've got to do. We've got to have people with courage, not just don't count on the politicians for all the courage. We citizens have to have the courage to, at that town meeting, be the one who doesn't go along with the obvious nonsense that climate change is a made-up story by Al Gore or something silly like that. You just tell them, let's look at the data. Let's look at facts. Let's look at reality. And let's look at the incredible opportunity that's ours if we do this the right way. And so yeah, it's up to us. As Pogo says, we met the problem and the problem is us. That's also got a corollary. We met the solution and the solution is us.
Great. All right. Well, thank you for those words. We are out of time. Thank you to all of you attendees for submitting so many questions. I apologize we were not able to make it through all of them, but thank you for asking some good questions and spurring a really good conversation. Bob, thank you so much for being with us today and for teaching us about this topic and for your leadership on the issue.
Well, it's been
really want to say thanks.
Great to be with you, Chris, and great questions for all the folks, and look forward to going on to victory here. We can do this thing if we do it together. Yeah.
So again, as I mentioned earlier, we've recorded the presentation, and we will send a link to all of the attendees afterwards. And if you enjoyed today's presentation, please consider joining SACE so that we can continue to work towards clean energy solutions for the Southeast. Visit cleanenergy.org for info on how to join and become involved. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day. Bye.